So today I get to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, double negatives. So let's start with this little courtroom scene here. So what you see is a defendant on the stand, and he's uttered this sentence, "I didn't do nothing." And we have a jury, and the jury seems to think that he's made a confession. Now, crucially, note that the jury is a jury of English majors, okay? So there appears to be some confusion in the courtroom. What's going on here? Well, at the heart of the confusion is this sentence. And we can call this sentence a double negative sentence. It's a double negative sentence because it has two what we would call negations. So the first negation, as you're reading along the sentence, comes here. You see this little particle that's attached to the word did, nt. So nt is our first negation. Keep reading, and we come to this word nothing. There's our second negation. So we have two negations in the sentence. I didn't do nothing. And what the courtroom scene is telling us is that this sentence is potentially ambiguous, so it can have a couple of different meanings. So the first meaning is the defendant's interpretation of this sentence. He's really saying, if we were to paraphrase what he's trying to say, it's, "I didn't do it." Okay, so that's the negative meaning of the sentence. The second meaning is the jury, how the jury is interpreting his sentence, which we could paraphrase by saying, "I did it," which is actually a positive interpretation of it. So those two negations are kind of canceling out, giving you this positive interpretation. So this is a double negative, and you probably have heard them before. And if you grew up in the US or in an American English-speaking culture, you probably have an opinion about them. So these are widely considered to be bad grammar. So this is an entry from the People's Dictionary, Urban Dictionary, and this individual who wrote this entry is calling double negatives improper English, quoting the Pink Floyd song saying, "We don't need no education." This person says, "Yes, you do, you just use a double negative." So this is reflective of a very widely shared opinion that these are bad grammar. Nevertheless, you see them all over the place. So you might be familiar with the recent, very popular Lil Nas X song, where in the refrain he says, "Can't nobody tell me nothing," so that we could call that a double negative. There's actually three negations in there. There's the popular Rolling Stones song, "I can't get no satisfaction," another double negative. Here's another double negative for you. So, "Nor, never, none shall be mistress of my heart." So this is actually like Lil Nas X. We've got three negations in there with just the negative meaning. And this was written by this guy represented in the wax figure, who is none other than William Shakespeare. So you may be familiar with him, and he's known for his linguistic abilities. So double negatives are not new. They've been around for a long time. How did they come to be considered so bad? How did they come to be considered bad grammar? Well, this has something to do with this guy. This is Bishop Robert Loth. He's someone we would call a prescriptive grammarian. And in the 1800s, he wrote this famous book where he talked about how English should be. And one of the things that he said is, in English, two negatives should equal a positive. So thinking back to the jury, they were behaving according to Bishop Loth's rules. They were saying, okay, that gives us a positive meaning, that sentence, "I didn't do nothing." So what do you think? You may have an opinion about these. Raise your hand if you think double negatives are bad grammar. Okay, lots of hands go up. Okay, so this is very, very common, and this is a very widely held opinion about double negatives. Why would I be asking you this? So why does your opinion about double negatives matter? Well, double negatives are a feature of a dialect. You may have heard the word dialect before. Everybody speaks a dialect if you think of it as just a version of a language. So even English majors speak a dialect. And you learn your dialect at home from your loved ones, from the people closest to you. So you speak how they speak. That is your dialect. So in a way, your dialect is very much a part of who you are. So when you criticize a feature of someone's dialect, you're in a sense criticizing who they are. And we talked about negative consequences that double negatives can have in a courtroom. This can also play out in educational settings. So you can think of schools where you have kids speaking different dialects, and if their dialect is judged, if they're using features that are judged to be bad grammar, this might have negative impacts on their educational outcomes. You can think of a job interview setting where if somebody were to use a double negative, that they might be judged negatively, and that could potentially hinder their chances of getting a job, forwarding their career. So in my research, I've done a lot of work on double negatives, I've thought a lot about this question, and what I've found is that actually people really do understand double negatives, even English majors. And by English majors, I mean people who don't use double negatives and people who say they're bad grammar. Not only that, but my research has also shown that actually, so double negatives, like any dialect feature, follow certain sets of rules depending on your dialect. And English majors, or people who don't use double negatives, actually know a set of grammar rules for double negatives. So before I can sort of show you how I found this, let's just think a little bit about what grammar is. So I'm a linguist. Specifically, I'm a syntactician, so I study relationships between I study sentence structure and relationships between word order and meaning in sentences. And so I have a different opinion about what grammar is than somebody like Bishop Robert Loth. But one thing that Bishop Loth and I can agree on is that grammars have rules. So let's look at another double negative sentence. So this is from, you see this nice big cheesecake here. This is from an old-timey commercial for Sara Lee pastries. And this is sung, so it's a jingle. And the jingle is everybody doesn't like something, but nobody doesn't like Sara Lee. So you're probably already attuned to this, and you probably noticed that this advertisement has a double negative sentence in it. So let's think about what this means. So remember, these can potentially be ambiguous. We can get either a positive or a negative interpretation of it, okay? For this one, what do you think Sara Lee wants? How do you think Sara Lee wants you to interpret it? Probably a positive, right? They want you to think everybody likes Sara Lee because they want you to buy their pastries, okay? So thinking about these, so we now have two double negative sentences. We can zoom in on these like a linguist might, like a syntactician might. And if we compare them, we see they both have this little particle nt. In the defendant's sentence, I didn't do nothing. The particle nt comes first, and we get a negative meaning. In the Sara Lee advertisement sentence, the particle nt comes second, and we get a positive meaning. So two different word orders and opposite meanings. So if we have this, we can now formulate this as a rule. So let's call it the English double negatives rule. So if you have nt first, you get a negative meaning, like the defendant intended in his sentence in the courtroom. And if nt comes second, you get a positive meaning, like Sara Lee wanted you to buy their pastries. So now we can ask, do English majors, that is people who don't use double negatives, who say they're bad grammar, do they know the double negatives rule? So do they have some kind of a grammar for double negatives? This might seem like a simple thing to do. You can just ask them and they'll tell you, right? But really, it's actually not so simple. And figuring this out is harder than you might think. And that's because people are so, as we saw, people are so against double negatives, people are so convinced that they're bad grammar, that if you just ask them flat out, they'll just tell you they're bad. So you won't really learn a lot about any fine-grained distinctions they might be making between these kinds of sentences. So we did a whole bunch of experiments. So we took double negative sentences like nobody doesn't like Sara Lee, and we put them in different contexts that bias the reader or the speaker either toward a negative or a positive reading. And then we asked them all kinds of questions about them. So we asked them to rate them on a scale of 1 to 7. So this gives us a scale. This gives us some numbers on a scale, which we can then use statistics to sort of tease apart fine-grained distinctions people might be making about meaning depending on word order. We also were able to track their eye movements. So eye tracking is something that we can use to understand how people are processing language. So as they're reading these contexts and they're reading these sentences, what we can do is we can see what happens when they get to the end of a double negative sentence. And what we know is that when people are struggling to understand something, they'll often go back and reread things. And so if the experiment is designed well enough, then we can compare how much time they spend rereading if the intended meaning is a positive or a negative reading based on the word order of the double negative. So for all of these experiments that we did, the answer was abundantly clear. It turned out that yes, in fact, English majors do know the double negatives rule. Okay? So whenever the nt came first, they reliably preferred that negative reading, which was the defendant's reading. So we now have scientific evidence that a jury would actually not be justified in coming to this conclusion that the defendant has made a confession. So moving beyond the courtroom scene, we can think about this more broadly in terms of linguistic diversity. So we live in this country that's incredibly linguistically diverse, and that's not just in terms of different languages being spoken, but also different dialects or versions of a language. So even right here in Pennsylvania, if you're in different neighborhoods in Philly versus Pittsburgh, you'll hear different versions of American English being used. And right here in central Pennsylvania, depending on what county you're in, what town you're in, even what household you're in, you might hear slightly different variations of the English language. And what my research has shown in the case of double negatives is that what's happening in these scenarios where we're interacting with people in these very natural settings is that we're picking up all kinds of things about grammar. So we're learning grammar rules for free. So I'd like to just leave you with a recommendation. Since we know that these double negatives have a grammar to them, don't be afraid of no double negatives. Appreciate them and appreciate the linguistic diversity that surrounds you instead. Thank you.